My talk is going to be a little bit, not just antibiotics in animals, but it's perception versus reality. And I think that's one of the battles the ag industry fights, is the misperceptions that are out there, sometimes intentionally communicated, sometimes accidentally. We've talked a little bit about it so far, but a few points just to show you what I'm trying to get across here. Foodborne illnesses are down 29% in the last decade. We don't get much credit for that. Media hits for foodborne illness outbreaks are up 150% in the last decade. And media hits for recalls of food are up 250% in the last decade. So it's no wonder the American public thinks we're letting them down with our food safety efforts. Not that we can't do better. I would never say we can't do better, and we will continue to do better. But the point is there's a misperception that we fail badly. And why is that? It's because of PulseNet, pulse field gel electrophoresis, introduced by the CDC in 1996, became very robust about 10 years ago. And because of PulseNet, we can now take what used to be isolated foodborne illnesses, we can link them together across this country, and if they all look exactly alike on their DNA fingerprint, we have more people now that we can query as to what they last ate in the last 3 days, whatever, and we can find a source. When you find a source, you have a recall. When you announce a recall, you have a criminal in some people's mind. You have a culprit. You have Wright Egg Farms. You have Peanut Corporation of America. You have the Jensen Family Farms. You have the farm in the Salinas Valley that told us you can get E. coli from eating spinach, to which we had never thought about before. It changed the world, and when you can put a name on it, that's going to sell newspapers. Somebody said in one of the talks earlier, you got to be inflammatory to sell media. Well, if you can name a culprit, you got somebody who's going to want to read about that. Think pink slime. Think Foster Farms, the most recent one. How they get slammed in the media because 360-some people got sick. But we eat 1.6 million servings of chicken a day in this country. And 300 got sick, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened, it seems like. Yes, they were sicker than average. I'll give you that. Higher rate of hospitalization. All that is tough, and I'm glad it wasn't me or my family. But we got to keep things in perspective when we talk about the way we raise animals in this country. A lot of consumers, as you know, view technology as bad. Antibiotics are a technology that helps us keep animals healthy, get them market weight quicker, etc. There are other technologies, however, besides beta-agonists, ractopamine, Zilmax, the antibiotics, hormones, RBST. There's a lot of technologies that we don't think about, however, when we're talking to consumers. Technologies like this. Transportation can cause animal trauma, animal stress. So we do a better job of transporting than we used to. Genetics and breeding and controlled climates and controlled feed allocations are all technologies that have increased the size of our hogs and our chickens and our turkeys and our beef, which is a good way to help feed the world with a safe food product that's affordable. We need to remember, when we talk technologies, do they want us to throw all of them out? Or just some that they don't like talking about? We got a perception that concentrated animal feeding operations in this country are bad, and they cause an increased risk of foodborne illnesses from consuming meat and poultry and necessitate the frequent use of antibiotics to control infections. That's the perception. In reality, we no longer see trichinosis from eating undercooked pork. We know that chickens that are free-range have a higher rate of salmonella in their feathers than chickens that are raised in confined operations. We know that children no longer get sick and die from tuberculosis and brucellosis from drinking raw unpasteurized milk. We know that the E. coli illnesses in 2010 were the lowest they had ever been since we started tracking E. coli 0157. We have made tremendous progress. The most recent announcement came from FSIS just about 10 days ago that for the second quarter of 2013, salmonella carcasses, young chicken carcasses, tested positive 2.7% of the time for salmonella. When I was at the USDA, it was 16%. I don't think confined feeding operations are making our chickens more contaminated with salmonella. In fact, there's some exciting new things coming forth that we're going to be hearing about sometime down the road, not today or tomorrow, about new ways to raise chickens in confined operations that's going to drop these salmonella rates even more dramatically. So for today's talk, we haven't got into this yet in the first 2 days. What is an antibiotic? I think we need to understand what an antibiotic is if we're going to talk about antibiotics. And there's a lot of different definitions out there. But by definition, an antibiotic is an antimicrobial that's actually produced by another microorganism and can kill or inhibit the growth of other microorganisms. That's very important to understand that. Because of that, ionophores are considered an antibiotic in this country because it comes from another organism to kill or inhibit the growth of another. We think penicillin, that's the classic. People don't think ionophores. But it's important to know that because when we get into the numbers, we're going to be talking about ionophores and others. Now, in Europe, they've got around this issue by just saying ionophores are not antibiotics. So that narrows their conversation. But for ours, we have to include the ionophores. By strictest definition, only 75% of antimicrobials used against microorganisms are antibiotics because they're natural occurring. The rest are synthetic compounds. But to make things simple, when we talk antibiotic, we'll talk like everybody else does. We'll include those synthetic compounds in the definition of antibiotic for today. What is antibiotic resistance? If I don't have the same pithy comment the guy does. I just say if somebody walks up to you and say, I understand antibiotic resistance, just turn around and walk away because you're just going to hear a little bit of BS. And it's a paraphrase of what Guy says. One thing I think to keep in mind as we have this discussion, these 2 days, is that we don't know how resistance develops. Plain old streptococcus doesn't seem to be getting resistant. Old strep throat still responds to penicillin, whereas, as we've heard repeatedly, Staph aureus seems to develop resistance before it's even exposed to the antibiotic. Every bug is different. And you can't explain why it changes from one bug to another. We've heard a lot of plasmid talk and stuff like that I don't really understand, so I don't get into all that much. I just know I don't understand for sure why some bugs get resistant and others. We hear a lot it's because of inadequate dosing too long, giving the wrong antibiotic for the wrong bacteria, whatever. Those things all contribute, I'm sure. But one concept we don't hear about much is that there is no antibiotic guaranteed to kill 100% of the pathogens that's making a person or an animal sick. I mean, when we're treating a pneumonia, and we treat you with the right dose for the right length of time, the right method of administration, whatever, in that debate, we treat you, you get well, you go home. We haven't necessarily killed every bacteria that was causing that infection. Some of them have developed resistance. There's just a few of them left, not enough to make you sick. But we have created resistance by treating with the right drug at the right dose for the right length of time. We still create resistance. Do we create more resistance treating illnesses or preventing illnesses? That's one of the big debates that we need to decide somewhere along the line. We've already heard about the approved uses of antibiotics in animals. I'm not going to go into that. What I want to talk about just very briefly, we also heard about it, but not all of you were here yesterday. But it's the same approved uses in humans as it is in animals with the exception of growth promotant. In humans, and people sometimes forget about this. They don't think about prevention and control. We use it in human medicine all the time. If you have a child in college living in a dormitory and someone else living in that dormitory comes down with meningitis and is hospitalized, your child will be offered 3 days' worth of penicillin by mouth to prevent the meningitis that he's been exposed to or she has been exposed to. One example given yesterday, I think it was Dr. Dwelle. If you go to the dentist for routine teeth cleaning and you have an artificial heart valve, you're going to get put on an antibiotic before and after the teeth cleaning to prevent seeding of that valve with bacteria. Multiple other examples you could give, but we use these purposes in human medicine a lot. So low dose versus high dose. I don't even like the word low dose. I don't like the word sub-therapeutic, Hector. Sub-therapeutic is wrong. It's a phrase. Low dose and therapeutic is meant to give people the misperception that we're underdosing. I'm the third one to do that. Yep, didn't work. I believe those words are intentionally used to give the misperception that the animal ag industry is exposing us to a greater risk of antibiotic resistance because we're using, quote, sub-therapeutic, end quote, doses. These doses that are used for prevention and control are doses approved by the FDA for those purposes. Your child will get 3 days of oral penicillin to prevent meningitis, whereas his roommate is going to get 10 days of intravenous high-dose penicillin. That's a therapeutic dose to prevent diseases. They are not sub-therapeutic. But which is a higher risk? Low dose in a herd to prevent disease or infection at a time that they're most vulnerable, like weaning, or treating 10% of that herd that got sick because we didn't prevent the scours, so we treat an active disease with a full dose of antibiotics. Which one causes the most resistance? I don't know. I'm not going to tell you anything about any lies about my knowing that, but we need to look at that Denmark experience again and see what happened with increased number of animals they had to treat when they got rid of the growth promotants. And you've heard all about that today in more detail than I can go into it. This is a slide you've already seen. I just don't have the dots on the top to show the increase in the swine herd. It's a common slide showing the increase of 110% of antibiotics used to treat sick animals based on a prescription from a doctor of veterinary medicine. Is that use going to create more resistance than the use of growth promotants? We don't have that answer. The World Health Organization said a few years ago there's been no decline in antibiotic resistance in bacteria in Denmark since the ban of growth promotants. Been no dramatic increase either, but it certainly has not been a decline. Okay, we've already talked about sub-therapeutic. We'll get around that. Federal government, we've heard from the FDA. I don't need to go into that anymore. They've limited the use of certain antibiotics over the years based on what they're seeing with the NARMS report and other evidence. We've heard from some people they don't like what they're doing. We've heard from other people they're doing the right thing. So again, some of these slides we're just going to fly over. The NARMS, you've heard all about NARMS from multiple different angles. A couple things that weren't brought out from that last NARMS report that came out in February. That's the one that sampled retail meats in 14 states. They sampled ground turkey, poultry, ground turkey, chicken, beef, and pork for 4 bacteria, which you've heard about. There's some good news. There's some bad news in that report. Bad news is, as expected, ampicillin resistance and salmonella continues to increase. What you didn't hear so far is that ciprofloxacin resistance in Campylobacter is down from 29% to 18% since it was banned. Now, I heard a question during the lunch hour that since the resistance to ciprofloxacin, the fluoroquinolones, has not gone down, we shouldn't have banned their use as a growth promotant. Well, if you look at the NARMS reports, you'll see the resistance was increasing dramatically, and that's why the FDA said no more off-label use, no more use in chicken feed, and resistance has gone down actually from 29 to 18%. As Guy and Dr. Scott said, that's not necessarily a link, but I'm just a family physician. I'm not a microbiologist. I think there is a link. It was going up. We stopped the use of it. It's going down. I know those two guys can get up here and argue yay and nay and have fun, but I'm going to stick with the fact that we're doing better. There were no isolates resistant to vancomycin or linezolid in any of these 4 categories of meat that were tested. These are good. This is good. These are drugs that are banned from use in the animal industry by the FDA. It's protecting those very, very critical drugs for my use when I get sick. There's no fluoroquinolone resistance in salmonella from any source. This is the drug of choice. That's a quote from the FDA. That's a paper that was put out after the Environmental Working Group put out a release saying the NARMS report says we're on the brink of a public health disaster. Look how awful it is. And the FDA came back, which they don't usually do, but they came back with a rebuttal saying they were overinterpreting all the results. And their quote is, no fluoroquinolone resistance in salmonella from any one of these 4 meats in the NARMS report. This is the drug of choice to treat salmonella. This is a good part of the report. Macrolide resistance in Campylobacter remained very low, 4.3% for C. coli and 0.5% for, say, jejuni. And the macrolides are the drug of choice to treat Campylobacter. So we're not seeing an increase in resistance to macrolides. That's the erythromycins. That's what some of you may know as a Z-Pak. We're not seeing a change in that for some reason. The fluoroquinolones, we saw a rapid increase in resistance. Different antibiotic, same bug. Nobody can explain that. Multi-drug resistance increased in salmonella, but remained extremely rare in Campylobacter. Of course, these are 2 pathogens that come from turkey and poultry. They're exposed to the same antibiotics in the growth of these birds, but yet no MDR in Campylobacter. Go figure. Nalidixic acid, which is fluoroquinolone that was banned back in 2005 for use in poultry, the resistance in E. coli in turkey dropped from 10% to 1%. Once again, I would submit to you that the ban is having the desired effect. And I would praise the FDA for that ban. Further comments from the FDA on the EWG's report. We do not believe they fully considered important factors. The NARMS data, this is critical, the NARMS data indicates that first-line treatments for all 4 of these bacteria that we track are still effective. You can talk all you want about MDR, you can talk all you want about increased resistance to ampicillin. The drugs of choice remain effective. We believe the Environmental Working Group is inaccurate and alarmist to define bacterial resistance to one or even a few antimicrobials as superbugs if these bacteria are treatable by other commonly used antibiotics, and I say amen to that. Okay, obviously I'm not going to spend any time on Guidance 209 or Draft Guidance 213. You heard that in great detail today, so I will not try to expand on that at all. I want to get into the numbers game just a little bit. Liars figure, figures lie. We've all heard that. And here's two quotes that I hate. They represent the two extremes. And I'm sorry if I offend somebody. Over 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are given to perfectly healthy animals raised for food. Congresswoman Slaughter says that all the time. The Pew says that on occasion. Multiple media, multiple bloggers. I believe the National Environmental Trust Council even uses that number. A lot of people use it. It's not a lie, as I said yesterday, but it's a misperception. It's meant to alarm people. It's meant to get you scared to death that 80% of all antibiotics are used in perfectly healthy animals, and that's not the point. However, on the other side, when you say all antibiotics administered to animals raised for food are given under the direct supervision and direction of a doctor of veterinary medicine, end quote, from the United States Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, you lose credibility. Anyone that knows the ag industry is not going to walk down that street with you. It's wrong to say that also. Now, we talked about the FDA report earlier this morning. This is what it looks like on the front page, and the second page is the numbers. My numbers are coming from that page right there on the right. These are not Raymond's made-up numbers. These are actual facts. And here's the title. Antimicrobials sold or distributed for use in food-producing animals. This is the link. You've already got that. Footnote number 2, right below that graph. Footnote number 2 says this includes companion animals. So I don't know why the label says food-producing animals when it's horses, cats, and dogs also, but it does. You've already also heard this is very misleading because it's by total weight. It's not by doses. It's not by number of treatments. It's just the total weight in kilograms of antibiotics sold, not necessarily used. When you treat this large animal for pneumonia, you're going to use tens of hundreds of kilograms of penicillin. When you treat that little baby, you're going to use maybe 10 milligrams 4 times a day. So the total weight does not really reflect use, but it's all we got. So that's what I'm going to base the next few slides on, is the numbers from the FDA. Ionophores on that report were 28.3%. In 2011, the 2012 report for 2011, it was 30%. You saw Dr. Apley's numbers. These just reconfirm what Dr. Apley has already told you. Tetracyclines in 2011 or 2010 were 41.5%. These are antibiotics that can lead to a healthy discussion about how important are they in human medicine. I believe personally they are almost zero importance. And I wish the FDA, if they're going to look at limiting antibiotics for growth promotants that are important, they would recognize that tetracycline really is not prescribed in the United States anymore. I'm talking oxytetracycline, chlortetracycline. There is a newer drug out, used to be called vibromycin by trade name. It's doxycycline. That's still prescribed a little bit. Makes up about 2% of all prescriptions written in the United States as a very poor second choice drug for certain specific diseases for which the macrolides are generally the drug of choice. You're going to hear me talk about macrolides a lot today. They are the drug of choice for many diseases. We need to keep them working in humans. Oxytetracycline, the last time I prescribed that as a physician was in the mid-1980s. I remember it well because I prescribed erythromycin for Rocky Mountain spotted fever. The man that took it got immediate GI side effects, couldn't tolerate, so the next drug of choice is oxytetracycline. He had to drive 125 miles to find a pharmacy that even stocked the drug in the mid-1980s. I asked my physician about a year ago when I was starting to work in the antibiotic area, I asked him, when was the last time you prescribed tetracycline? He said, they don't even make it anymore, do they? I mean, it's just not used in human medicine. So then you've heard about the not individually reported, which is, by statute, the FDA cannot report these drugs because they're made by 2 or fewer companies. So it's considered privileged information. That's 12% of all antibiotics sold for use in animals. I've looked at that list. It's about 10 to 12 drugs. 4 quinolones are on there, which are minimally prescribed in animal medicine. I can't pronounce most of the other names. They're almost all drugs used solely in animals. So I'll say, let's give 10% to not even allowed in human use. I need to stress, ionophores are not allowed for use in human medicine. They would make you very sick. I've been told sometimes I don't explain that very well, so let me make it clear. 30% of the prescriptions are ionophores, 10% are in this not individual reported, not used in human medicine. That's 40%. Add 42% for tetracycline, you now have 82% of all antibiotics used in animal medicine are of little or no use in human medicine. I want to talk about the other 18%. That 80% number needs to go out the window. Let's talk about the 18% where there's actually some overlap. Now, there are 6, Dr. Dwelly listed 15 classes of antibiotics. Most of those represent a tenth or 0.2% of prescriptions. Of the commonly prescribed antibiotics that make up maybe 98% of all antibiotics written, there are 6 classes. Cephalosporin is number 2. Very, very important. You've heard a lot about cephalosporin, ceftriaxone, ceftiofur already in a first day and a half. They are critical medicines in human medicine. They comprise 0.2% of all prescriptions used in animal medicine. Very little overlap. The fluoroquinolones, number 4 in frequency prescribed in human medicine, is 0.1% in animal medicine. The FDA is protecting us with those 2 categories of drugs very well. I love graphs. I think pictures sometimes are worth 1,000 words. It explains itself. I hope you can read it from the back. The left-hand side is 82% of the volume sold for use in animals, and there's almost no human use. And then on the right-hand side is 68% of the total volume sold for humans. There is some overlap with the penicillins, almost no overlap with cephalosporins and fluoroquinolones. That's number 1, 2, and 4 categories of drugs used in human medicine. So where is there overlap? Fair amount in sulfa. Macrolide use is just about equal in animals and in humans. And we've talked about that a little bit already this morning. The last presenters said, Dr. Scott, I believe it was, said, if we got rid of macrolides as growth promoters in chickens, we would see an increase in Campylobacter. Think about it. We have over 1 million cases of Campylobacter in this country every year. If that increases 5%, we have 1,050,000. Is that of public health significance, or is it the 1 million and the 5% of those are resistant to commonly used antibiotics, and we can't treat those people? Which is more important, 5%? I would say I would rather take a chance of getting Campylobacter that has no resistance than having a reduced risk of getting Campylobacter but an increased risk of not being able to treat it. Again, I don't have the science. I'm not going to say I'm absolutely right. I want you to think about it. I want to get macrolides out of the chicken feed. No, Elanco didn't write that for me. Nope, Merck didn't write that for me. Tetracycline. I've already kind of basically told you what I think about tetracycline. The macrolides are the drug of choice for these things. The old oxy and chlorotetracyclines were really good back in the 50s and early 60s because we didn't have much else. We had them and penicillin and a little sulfa. You have to take these drugs 4 times a day on an empty stomach, 2 hours before or 2 hours after a meal. How many of you could comply with that 4 times a day? It's just damn tough. So you might take 3, or you might take a couple too close to the ingestion of a dairy product, which breaks down the antibiotic. What happens? You now are sub-therapeutically dosed. And the antibiotic resistance developed so rapidly that by the early 80s, these drugs just simply were not used in human medicine. We've heard plenty about staph. I don't think I can probably give you any more information about staph than we've heard from multiple speakers. And MRSA, my guys, we've talked about MRSA. I throw these slides in here because when I'm talking to what I might call a naive audience, the national pork producers that have to go out and talk to their media folks or their Chamber of Commerce president or their mayor, what are you doing with those confined? I want to give them information so they can have a discourse. You folks have heard so much about MRSA, you don't need me. Especially after my good friend Paul Fay started out at this level and kind of brought it down to where most of us could understand what Paul was trying to transmit about animal and communication, MRSA back and forth. So we won't dwell on that at all. I would point out that this transfer back and forth with workers in the industry is not unusual. We've been passing diseases back and forth between animals and humans for years and years and years. In fact, 75% of all new infectious diseases that we're seeing are coming from animals to humans. It's not unusual to transmit. It's not a headline. As I said, we still use plain old penicillin G for strep throat and for syphilis. Those two gram-positive infections have developed no resistance. We don't know why. I want to talk a little bit about superbugs, so we have on the same page here on definitions, and this is FDA, not Richard Raymond. A superbug is any bacteria resistance to multiple antibiotics, leaving limited or no options to treat. And there definitely are superbugs out there, like the methicillin and vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus, like carbapenem-resistant enterococci, like the extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis that Dr. Dwelly already talked about, like the vancomycin-resistant enterococcus, vancomycin-resistant Staph, Clostridium difficile, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. These are superbugs. These are bugs that the Infectious Disease Society of America say have no link to the animal industry. These are all linked to human health and hospitals. Vancomycin, I mentioned earlier today, is one of the very newest of these superbugs, and it's not because of overuse or misuse or sub-therapeutic dosing. This is a powerful drug used only under the direct supervision of a healthcare professional, usually in a hospital setting or at least an infusion center. The patient doesn't stop taking it when the sore throat goes away. They take the full 10 days or 14 days or whatever has been prescribed by their provider. But still, we get resistance to it. Multi-drug resistant Salmonella, and we already heard that today earlier, an admission that yes, we can pick up foodborne illnesses that are resistant to antibiotics because of the use of antibiotics in the industry. And multi-drug-resistant Salmonella probably has a connection with the food supply and the antibiotic use in animals, but they are not necessarily superbugs. And everybody stole my talk already today, but I was hoping maybe you were drowsing off once or twice. If that Salmonella is resistant to tetracycline and kanamycin and gentamicin or streptomycin, it's not a superbug because everything we would use to treat Salmonella is still effective. If it is resistant to fluoroquinolones and sulfa and macrolides, it might be a superbug. But just because you have MDR Salmonella does not mean you have a superbug. The outbreak on the California coast, those bacteria were sensitive to Bactrim, the sulfa drug. They were sensitive to fluoroquinolone, the drug of choice for an adult. They're sensitive to the macrolides. They're sensitive to ceftriaxone. The providers out there had 4 drugs to choose from. It would be the top 4 drugs they would ordinarily use to treat that bacteria. Those were not superbugs. We do not need to make it an adulterant, but we might hear differently at 2 o'clock. I'm open-minded. The February NARMS report stated that MDR Salmonella was increasing in percentage. Those that are against the slaughter of animals for food acted enraged and alarmed. The February NARMS report shows that for retail chicken and ground turkey, the 4 most common antibiotics that Salmonella showed resistant to were tetracycline, streptomycin, sulfazoxazole, and penicillin, not drugs used to treat Salmonella. In reality, none of these drugs would be used to treat Salmonella infection, and I've already mentioned Bactrim, the quinolones, the macrolides, all first-line antibiotics still work, according to the NARMS report. Okay, I used to think this was a brilliant part of my presentation, but Guy and Scott already took care of this. There was a report came out in September from the UK. I don't think they touched on this one. It's their 5-year strategy to reduce antibiotic resistance in the UK. Page 8, the introduction page, the pages 7 before that were all indexes and stuff. Increasing scientific evidence suggests that the clinical issues with antimicrobial resistance that we face in human medicine are primarily the result of antibiotic use in people rather than the use of antibiotics in animals. And again, I'm not saying we're perfect the way we are, but the UK says most of the problems they're seeing comes from human medicine. The CDC report, which you've heard about already, is a 100-plus page report. They have 3 or 4 pages on the use of antibiotics, and a quote from this report is, "The use of antibiotics is the single most important factor leading to antibiotic resistance around the world. Antibiotics are among the most commonly prescribed drugs used in human medicine. Up to half of the antibiotic use in humans is unnecessary or inappropriate." That's just driving home the point that Dr. Solomon and Dr. Tokes made yesterday. And they recognize that fact, but they also acknowledge in the report we need to take a close look at how antibiotics are used in animals also, because that can play a factor. Use of antibiotics leads to resistance. But both of these big reports that came out in September point the finger mostly at human medicine. I had a slide in here, thank gosh I took it out because I didn't think it was interesting, about the Scotland report, which these guys talked about in great detail, so I'm glad I took that one out, because they got way over my head on that one. So I'm about done here. The numbers game, back to that. The debate over the amount sold or used is just diversionary. It is not the main issue in the public health debate about antibiotic resistance. That's to quote Ron Phillips from the Animal Health Institute. Glad I attributed the quote, since I met Mr. Phillips for the first time yesterday. The issue shouldn't be the amount or frequency of antimicrobials used. The real issues are, 1, the judicious use of antimicrobials, and 2, is there a significant impact on human health? That's from the AVMA. I agree 100%. It's not whether it's 80%. I don't care if it's 10% or 80% or 99%. I want to know, is it going to have an impact on my health? It's not the numbers. Perception. We don't want this to be another pink slime fiasco. The animal ag industry, the perception is that you are being painted as irresponsible and inappropriate users of massive amounts of antibiotics in healthy animals, when in fact, this is a take-home. The current uses and doses of antibiotics in animals have all been approved by the FDA as appropriate. They're not low-level, they're not sub-therapeutic, they're not overused. They've been approved by our regulatory authorities at the FDA as appropriate, and the doses are appropriate. If there's misuse out there, shame on that person. If there's abuse out there, we need to find it and stop it. But for the most part, the men and women in the industry are all concerned about their animals' health. They love their animals dearly. They want to keep them healthy, and they're using medicines as approved by the FDA. Do not let someone make this bigger than it is. Statement from Ron DeHaven, the Executive Vice President, CEO of the American Veterinary Medical Association, who actually used to head up APHIS when I was at the USDA, so we became very good friends. And Ron gave me this quote, because I was talking to him about antibiotic use, asked him what he thought, and he says, when policy regarding the judicious and safe use of antibiotics in food-producing animals is being debated and formulated, it should be based on biological science, not political science. Now, what is the biological science after presentation at 11 o'clock? I'm not sure what we're going to base our decisions on anymore. But I am worried about the political science part of it, and there is a game called political science. And I mentioned yesterday, if we're not involved in this game and at the discussion and trying to find out what the true science really is, political science will win. And let me give you an example why this worries me so much. When I was at the USDA, we met probably every 2 months with industry, packers and processors. Included in that audience was our bargaining unit, our top scientists, academics, the consumer advocacy organizations, CSPI, CFA, CU, Food and Water Watch. It was a very diverse group, and we presented a plan to do risk-based inspection in our processing plants. Now, every plant has to have an inspector in it daily. Processing plants don't have to have them continuous. Slaughter does, but processing, you can have a circuit with 3 plants on it, and you have to be in each one every day. And you're given an assignment as an inspector. This is what you're going to look for today. This is what you're going to look for tomorrow. The week's work is laid out. And it takes just as much time to review a HACCP plan in a plant making ground beef that's been shuttered twice in the last year for outbreaks. It takes just as much time to do it there as it does in a plant over here who hasn't gotten an NR for noncompliance report for 2 months because they believe in food safety from the president down to the chief cook and bottle washer, and they're making cooked hams, one of the safest products on the market. They get the same amount of inspection every day. That is wrong. If you want to catch drunk drivers, you put your state patrolman outside the bar at midnight on Saturday. You don't put them outside church at noon on Sunday. I mean, it's common sense. What we had some trouble with was determining which foods were. We had a 2-part thing. Your amount of inspection was going to be based on what product you were making. Cooked hams, you weren't going to get much inspection. Ground beef, frozen patties, really high risk. You're going to get a lot more inspection. And then it's going to be based on your safety record. That's where the debate really centered around. How do you determine plant safety? Well, we spent 2 years hacking that around with everybody at the table, and we kept going back and reformulating this grid a little bit, and we finally had something that just almost everybody agreed on. we were ready to unveil risk-based inspection. And in this grid, the company over here was going to get maybe 30 minutes a day, and the company down here was going to get maybe 3 hours a day. And we were going to improve food safety without hiring one more inspector, spending one more dime, and still meet the federal law. Well, there was a bill called the Iraqi Supplemental Funding Bill because we were running out of money to fight the war in Iraq. So this is a bill that absolutely has to pass to protect our men and women over there, right? In Washington, D.C. and in many states, and this is what Dr. Halverson was talking about, they start tacking on amendments that don't get any public debate, don't get any discussion, because by God, we got to get that Iraqi bill funded, so every senator puts something on there so they can go back to their constituents and say, look what I got for us. In Nebraska, we called that Christmas treeing a bill. Here's the Christmas tree. It's going to be there no matter what, and then you put the balls all over the damn thing. And that one congresswoman, Rosa DeLauro, who was the chair of the Ag Appropriations Committee, therefore kind of my boss, because she controlled what I could spend, tacked an amendment on the Iraqi funding bill that said FSIS can spend no tax dollars to further promote risk-based inspection. Done. Dead in the water. Why? Somebody was worried we were going to cut down the number of bargaining unit members in those plants. They were worried we'd keep the same amount of inspection that was currently did in the bad plant and just decrease the inspection in the good plant. Therefore, you don't need as many inspectors. This is all about jobs. You don't want policy regarding antibiotic use in animals made in that fashion. You need to be proactive and continue doing things like you're doing here today and tomorrow, and including more and more diverse members like we had yesterday, like we're going to hear from Susan from CSPI shortly. You need to listen to everybody and find out where can we get together and talk. What is the common ground? Let's get rid of the inflammatory talk, the misquotes that don't do any of us any good. Let's talk about the 18%. Let's talk about macrolides. That is my concern. Again, transportation issues. This is in Hanoi. She was referred to as the chicken lady, and she was in this wet market every day, bringing her chickens and her eggs for sale. No antibiotics, cage, range free, but I'm not sure how safe or healthy they were.